Welcome to the CRC Roundtable, our monthly virtual seminar series. Again, just as our reminder, our intention is to host targeted, inclusive, and informed conversation that match scientific advances and management needs. The webinars are designed for contribution, not consumption, which means we have the panelists give about 25 minutes for time to make remarks, to make some introductory remarks. We allow 30 minutes for a facilitated discussion. I have a list of questions that were submitted ahead of time, and you are also welcome to put questions into the chat, and that's how we'll facilitate the discussions. This is all about us and allowing us to sort of ask the clumsy questions and practice the bravery and humility necessary. Let me start, as we always do, by understanding why this topic at this time and by these speakers. Last month's roundtable took a deeper dive into the implications of the Science and Technical Advisory Committee's report that was titled Comprehensive Evaluation of System Response, or as we affectionately refer to it as CESR. If you haven't heard of CESR before, it's a 115-page report that contains scientific consensus of over 60 Chesapeake Bay watershed and bay researchers on questions that range from efficiency of non-point source management programs to the living resource responses that we are seeking, or lack thereof. One of the things that CESR raised actually was two opportunities to address the living resource question, to target water quality improvements to where and what people care about, and to supplement those water quality efforts with other management actions that boost the living resource response to those water quality improvements. As a disclaimer, because of looking through the questions that were submitted, CESR focused this discussion on shallow tidal water environments, but the concepts of focusing on the where and what of people care about and how to ensure that we make the most out of water quality improvements are equally applicable to shallow non-tidal environments. But we are tackling tidal environments first in this webinar. CESR's suggestion to focus additional effort on shallow water environments in the land-water interface raises a very fair question. Do we know what to do and where to do it? And so these speakers represent the ability to address that very critical question. They represent both the production of new knowledge and its implementation into the existing effort, and they do it from both the private and public sectors. And to my mind, they represent the most clear-eyed view of both the opportunities and the challenges of focusing on these areas. Let me just give you brief to supplement their descriptions here. Pam works on the implementation of integrated coastal management in Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay, as well as national and international areas. And her primary focus has always been on natural and nature-based features as an approach to climate resilience. If you looked at her LinkedIn profile, she's billed as a thought leader on coastal science translation and incorporation into policy, and I can personally attest that that is a verifiable and truthful claim. She's also a fierce lover and advocate of wetlands, so be prepared. I've also known Jeff for a long time. He has held an incredible range of perspectives, from Assistant Secretary of Natural Resources for Virginia to EPA Senior Advisor for the Chesapeake Bay, to his new position at a private firm called Native Shorelines. And I just learned that Jeff was actually a part of and in the room of the TMDL. If anyone understands how to take something from policy to on-the-ground application, it's him. And so with that, I will let them start. And each of our panelists have extensive experience. I'm sure each of them could fill an hour by themselves, but we've asked them to limit their remarks to a very short time period. Pam and Jeff, I will try to gracefully let you know where you are at the 12-minute mark. And if you have material that you're unable to share because of that time limit, we find a way to get it out to everyone who's registered. So with that, Pam, you have the floor.
Thank you for that generous and kind introduction. And I'm very excited to be talking with you all today. So Denise kind of teed up a little bit of my perspective. So I'm going to, let me switch my screen here to my, a minute. I'm going to stop sharing so I can rearrange my laptop for 1 second. So yeah, I'm going to be speaking mostly today from the perspective of, as Denise kind of teed up, from the tidal shores and tidal part of the world. I am a wetlands ecologist, and that is my primary interest. And so if everybody can give me, or somebody can give me a thumbs up or a yes, you can see my screen.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So my focus today is going to be from more of the specifically tidal wetlands and the potential for the tidal wetlands outcome, or the wetlands outcome in this case, to drive Chesapeake Bay living resources restoration. And Denise did warn you that I'm a fierce lover of wetlands, so you're going to get a lot of wetlands information today. But I want to start with the basic background from the Chesapeake Bay program wetlands outcome perspective. So in 2014, the Bay Partnership did sign agreement, and in that agreement, we committed as a partnership to restore and create 85,000 acres of wetlands. Now that's wetlands with a capital W, so that's tidal and non-tidal combined. And that is a net wetland gain. That was at least the intention when we put together the goal, the outcome. Since then, a whole lot of things have happened. Number one, that net wetland gain was based on a net resource gain that had to be bounded by our understanding of what wetlands resources were in 2014, which means a continued commitment and achievement of no net loss. And that's kind of complicated now, because we have since realized, and we sort of knew it a little bit before 2014, but we're not in a position to codify it, that particularly tidal wetlands, but also non-tidal wetlands, are changing in aerial extent and in location in the landscape. And so we are not necessarily achieving no net loss, even from a natural perspective, let alone the fact that some of our tidal and non-tidal wetlands compensation goes into in lieu fees, which are not yet wetlands on the ground. So that's another small piece, plus the things that we don't know are changing or don't know through enforcement. So we're not necessarily achieving no net loss now. And in fact, from a tidal wetlands perspective, we know that there's going to be a net resource gain, a net resource loss. So two other small things: the non-tidal wetlands and the tidal wetlands were separated in where they sit in the Chesapeake Bay model. From the model perspective, this does have some ramifications. They're not huge, but I just wanted to note that non-tidal wetlands are considered to be part of the watershed, what we call the loading model, and tidal wetlands are now part of the estuarine hydrodynamic model. The other thing that's really critical to the element of wetlands outcome relative to the Bay program interests and things that were talked about in CESR is wetlands are tied to 10 other Chesapeake Bay goals and 31 other outcomes. Things like clean water, fish habitat, clean streams. In some cases, they're sort of tied or associated with, due to their location, with floodplains, with riparian buffers, with SAV, because they often are in co-occurring geographies. Also identified in our most recent effort to assess where we are relative to our outcomes, something called the Outcome Attainment Team, or OAT, is that the wetlands outcome is way off track for attainment by 2025. So within that space, I wanted to share a couple of the CESR findings that are particularly relevant to what I think are particularly relevant to the wetlands issue and the shallow water restoration of tidal marsh and or non-tidal wetlands along stream edges. So there are legal requirements of the TMDL. Divert attention from living resources. So I highlighted those three terms just to sort of dumb it down and make it really simple to understand. At least from my perspective, one of the major problems with trying to achieve wetlands outcomes is we weren't paying attention to wetlands. We were paying attention to the legal requirements of the water quality goal. The other thing that has confounded our ability to work on wetlands and know where we are in terms of achieving net resource gain is that the Bay program has a sophisticated accounting process. It's known as NEAN, and then that goes into CAST, and then we use that to model where we are. Well, one of the things that we have discovered in a lot of conversation about wetlands is there are wetlands that are being put on the ground, particularly in urban landscapes that aren't even being counted as wetland projects towards the habitat goal. So the wetlands outcome is a habitat outcome. But wetlands are also noted and approved as both non-tidal and tidal vegetated wetlands as part of living shorelines are approved as best management practices from the water quality perspective. So there's a driver there from a water quality perspective, but it makes practitioners and sometimes decision makers lose sight of the fact that the wetlands are a habitat outcome, and wetlands are linked to so many other outcomes, specifically in the shallow water. So I wanted to start with habitat. Usually this list, when I give this talk, always starts with water quality, but in this case, it seemed like that was inappropriate. So I'm going to start with habitat. So wetlands are known and verified to be habitat for aquatic crustaceans, aquatic finfish, aquatic shellfish, terrestrial species, feeding shorebirds, wading birds, ducks. People like to hang out. We don't necessarily live there, but there are some resources that are linked to that, including commercial and recreational fishing. Wetlands provide flood benefits, and in fact, as open space, they can be credited through the community rating system, which is a process of reducing the cost of national flood insurance program for folks that live in communities that participate in that process. They obviously do improve water quality. They remove nitrogen, sediment, and phosphorus from waterways. They can do that depending on where they are from the in situ water. So in other words, tidal waters that come in under the tidal wetlands and or runoff waters. And so if you're a tidal wetland, you could get, you are in a position to have the opportunity often to intercept pollutants from both directions of water flow. They also are known to store carbon and can improve social vulnerability communities by providing some of these co-benefits in a place where people may or may not be in a position where they fish frequently for their food sources that are also important for cultural entities. Many of our tribal communities have special relationships and important roles for wetlands and also for recreation. So when we're considering tidal marsh restoration as an output for a process that then can improve our shallow water living resources conditions, there are things we need to think about. So for tidal marsh restoration, it's important to think about vertical and horizontal scales, where along and across the shore, often we can plan tidal marshes to expand the existing footprint of a marsh system. We can use tidal marsh creation to infill gaps. We need to consider where we do those projects and what the time frame is for those. And I get asked a lot of times, so what about larger marsh restoration? What about living shorelines? What about different scales, scopes and scales of marsh projects? And I say we need scopes and scales of marsh projects of all kinds, because we have diminishing marsh area extent now, and we know it's going to diminish into the future. We have multiple drivers for people that want to either protect their property or are involved in restoration. So let's consider linear wetlands along shorelines that we know provide the greatest edge effect to living resources, aquatic living resources, but let's also consider those bigger habitats. Where's the shoreline going to be in the future? We can incorporate some of those decision making, knowing that in some cases, some of the projects we build may not last 50 or 60 years, but they'll last 40 or 50 years. And then some of the ones we build will last 60 and 80 years. And we have to accommodate that different thinking when we're making these plans. Also important to consider the habitat shifts. What other coastal habitats exist and coexist with wetlands? Wetlands are often found on shorelines, on the open bay shorelines associated with beaches and dunes. Typically, we have riparian habitats, the landscapes, the upland immediately adjacent to the wetlands. Are those habitats forested? Are they also supporting water quality? Are they providing habitat connectivity with marshes? A lot of our marsh birds use both upland trees and marsh for their life cycle, for feeding and nursery and raising their young. We want to consider social scales and the elements of diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice in our planning. And then we need to consider our governance. Is integrated guidance, is easy to consider things at this scale, and what can we do to modify how we can do that thinking, so that we can really think of wetlands within a larger setting along the shallow waters, and maximize our incentives and partnerships to get those projects out on the ground.
Pam, you have about 2 to 3 minutes if you
Okay.
can.
I wanted to do this slide really quickly. I'm not going to walk you through it. I just wanted to show there's a new project that is being run at VIMS, and its evaluation. It is specifically to living shorelines. However, the metadata research, you can see 120 or so studies were analyzed for these particular benefits that are shown on the slide here, and attributed evaluation. And so we did a value transfer benefit function to determine these. So one of the things that people have been interested in to help make decisions around what kinds of projects to do is what are some actual values in dollars, and that allows us to start to compare things like engineered solutions to water quality benefits to the value of wetlands for water quality benefits, or the actual value of the fish habitat, recreational fishing, and storm flood reduction, which has a huge value. So I'm just going to show that really quickly. What are the challenges? Shorelines are privately owned. The landscape is privately owned. Our populations in the coast are growing. We know that it is the largest densely occupied portion of our country, both along all our coasts. Sea level rise, projected marsh loss, habitat shifts, all these are going to confound our efforts to do this work and improve the habitat conditions. We also know we'll have increased storminess and temperature rise. Wetlands will probably deal relatively well with the temperature rise, but there is research that is going into that. Then, of course, there's some conflicts. We know that there's the coastal economy is driven by navigation, commerce. We have shifting landscapes in our coastal agriculture, but we also have coastal aquaculture. And then, of course, again, there's the question of justice and systems level work that includes integrating all those things: wetlands, oysters, SAB, and buffers. Finally, I wanted to leave a slide. I know this one's very busy, but we are looking forward to some improved conditions. So with the wetlands outcome being so far off track, it has become the focus as of the last 2.5, 3 years of a lot of different folks that are working in the Bay program, either through the governance or through our partnerships or through our funding. And so there's a lot of things that have happened to help move this forward. We have a wetland specific project tracker that counts wetlands from a habitat perspective. So whether they're also qualifying as BMPs, we're going to capture all those things. So restoration that's being done that isn't specific for BMPs, we will be keeping track of that. Finally, wetlands action plans, each jurisdiction, but for West Virginia, that has a very small area in our land, in the Bay watershed, have produced action plans, and they will be providing updates to the management board in December. There's many GET funded projects that have persisted over time and continue to persist to look at issues like marsh migration corridors, wetland conditions, mapping and improving wetland mapping in headwaters, and then one on the effects of wetland mowing. We have a capacity grant with the Chesapeake Bay Trust. They are specifically going to help us work on tidal wetlands and moving forward on developing a blueprint for doing more coastal wetland siting. And then finally, we have had a recent change in best management practice verification. So wetlands that are being built and are getting credit for the BMP load reductions that they provide will no longer expire. We have these terms that people use in the water quality world about falling off or falling out of age. And we've recognized that once wetlands are built and conferred by the permitting agencies to be an actual wetland, they are thereby then legally protected. And so we've minimized the need to verify those practices over time. So hopefully that will free up time of people that are doing verification to actually do more projects. And that is my last slide. So hopefully I got right in under time.
Yes, you did. Excellent job. Thank you, Pam. And we'll move right on to Jeff. Jeff, are you ready?
I am. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Thank you very, very much for having me here. You know, I've spent 25 plus years Chesapeake Bay doing policy work and working in the NGO field, but I've been in the private sector for a number of years. So I've kind of been out of the broader, following it a lot, but I've kind of been out of the broader Bay program restoration discussion. So I always feel like I'm back at a family reunion when I have these kind of gatherings. So thank you. And let me just start with a couple real quick kind of overarching comments. This whole refocusing discussion that's coming out of CESR is going to be a huge discussion, and sometimes I think hugely uncomfortable, because to me, refocusing also means unfocusing. You know, you can't simply do everything you're doing now plus more. That's not realistic. That's not sustainable. So refocusing means, are we going to do less of something in some places? Are we going to fund less of some things in some places? Are we going to hit the pause on the computer model periodically and just implement and see what happens? And I think all those things need to happen, but they're going to be difficult discussions. Let's be honest with ourselves. But so this cannot simply be an academic exercise. If we are going to refocus, come up with new directions, new plans, we have to make sure that we can actually do what we say we're going to do. We need to learn from the past. So I'm going to talk about shorelines, particularly living shorelines. And the good thing with shorelines is there's not a question of whether or not we can restore and protect our shorelines and do it in a quote unquote living shoreline approach. We know how to do it. We do it every day, and companies like ours do it all over the Chesapeake Bay and all over the nation. So we know how to do it. The question is, can we do enough of it if we're really going to focus big time on our shorelines? And the challenges can be many. So I always need to remind myself, not everybody puts on a pair of waders every day and builds a shoreline like I do. So living shorelines, what are they? You use natural materials. You reduce the wave energy to reduce those erosional forces. You adequately slope the shoreline, give it back its natural shape and its natural profile. You add native plants, or at least you create an environment so that native plants can move back in. So what you see on the screen is the technical definition from NOAA. What I like to say is much simpler. Think of the old way, you know, and I'm going to show you two pictures here that are right down the street from each other in the same county in North Carolina. Think of the old way where you do a wooden bulkhead or a vinyl bulkhead, and then do pretty much the opposite. You know, do it in a much more softer, less hardened, low energy environment. You're not stopping the energy with a living shoreline. You're simply redirecting it or knocking down that energy and giving the shoreline itself a chance to thrive and to recover. So work with nature, don't fight nature. One of the critical or very common parts of a living shoreline is usually some sort of a waterward endpoint. You've got some sort of a line there in the water, and that's a near shore shallow water sill. And there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of alternatives for how you do this. The picture in the middle is what our company uses. It's called Quick Reef. I'm not here to sell our product, just want to show you a picture of it. Upper left are oyster castles. These are becoming somewhat ubiquitous throughout the bay. 30-pound cinder blocks made by Allied Chemical, or Allied Concrete, my apologies. They work. They're not my favorite type of thing, but they do work, and they're easy to use. Below that, I believe that's a picture of reef balls, but this looks like a site where they're actually doing research on various types. Reef balls come in everything from basketball-sized things to pickup truck-sized pieces. Upper left, Matrix. These are some friends of ours down in North Carolina. They 3D print these things. Pretty cool the way they do it. And then the last picture is simply using granite. You know, you can use stone. It's just as long as the overall project has, you know, a more living component to it, you can use whatever you want for that sill structure. But usually, not always, but usually there's a near shore structure to kind of knock down that wave energy. There's many benefits. Actually, Pam talked a little bit about this, so the multiple benefits of wetlands. There's a lot of benefits that come out of shoreline and living shorelines that you don't get on land-based practices. So suppose a farmer puts in winter rye cover crops, reduces nitrogen and phosphorus in winter and sediment runoff in the winter time. Gets a lot of benefits to the farmer, but the additional benefits to water quality and living resources are somewhat limited. But on a shoreline project, not only do you get the nutrient reductions and the sediment reductions, you get fish habitat, you get shellfish habitat, you get bird habitat. I can tell you, Pam actually, I think, mentioned birds about wetlands as well. Almost every single one of our projects that we go back to later to check on have egrets or herons or gulls or something sitting on them because we have created that habitat for those birds. Obviously, you get the reduced erosion, you're cutting back on, you're reducing land loss. If it's done right, land will accrete. You can actually create land with living shorelines. Flood resiliency component is huge. And if you design these things right and they are truly living structures, they can keep pace with sea level rise if done right. And that's a big topic of discussion in the living shoreline scientific world these days. So, challenges. This is really what I want to talk about. I think we need to be honest with ourselves here. Shallow water, refocusing on wetlands and refocusing on shorelines and refocusing on oysters and SAV, all those shoreline have all those living resource habitats. That does not mean it's going to be easier. In fact, I would argue today to you all that it might actually be harder. So we need to go into this discussion really with eyes wide open. First of those challenges, education. Even though we do living shorelines with my company, and many companies are out there doing this, every day we're putting in shoreline protection. The majority, if not most, of the landowners, they want what they used to have, or they want to have what the neighbor down the street has, which is a vinyl bulkhead or a wooden bulkhead or granite riprap on their shoreline. So there's still an enormous educational component. And to be honest, you're asking somebody to pay to do something on their shoreline, and they're not actually certain what this new living shoreline thing is. So a lot of education still needs to happen. Private property issue, as Pam mentioned this, I think the number in Virginia, and I think this may be a Bay-wide number, 85% of all shoreline is privately owned. So it's difficult. You start really quickly, you start getting into a private property issue discussion here if you start telling people what to do and how to do it on their shoreline. Interestingly, though, Virginia, we are starting to move in that way. Virginia now has a law for the past 2 years. If you are going to improve your shoreline, to protect your shoreline, it must be a living shoreline. And for months or 2 years now, that issue has been, well, what is a living shoreline? What passes the test? What doesn't? How do I get an exemption to not put in a living shoreline? So we are starting, the governments are starting to move towards a position where you must use living shorelines if at all possible. Maryland has a similar law. So does the District of Columbia. The cost issue here. Everybody, interestingly, like even some people that we work with on our shorelines that can pay for this out of their pocket, could probably pay for multiple projects out of their pocket. If there's a cost share program available, they want help paying for it. And I can't say I blame them. And we need to also be honest here. All this money coming down from the federal government and state, passing through the state governments these days through the bipartisan infrastructure law, multiple options, billions of dollars coming down. Huge opportunity, making a lot of progress. It is not sustainable. It's not going to be there forever. So make use of it, but be honest that the money we're seeing coming down today is not the money that we're going to continue to see. And a lot of the money that is coming out, and I feel like every week I'm on another webinar learning about another $500 million pot of money. I mean, it's phenomenal. But a lot of it is going towards community-sized projects. If they're going to fund a project, they want a big bang for the buck for the community. They want a portion of it to go towards Native Indian tribes. They want a portion of it to go towards underserved communities. All things that everybody on this webinar fully supports. Think back to my previous slide, 85% of all the shorelines in the Bay watershed are privately owned. So we have to figure out a way to get some of those funds to more and more to privately owned landowners. And that's going to be an interesting discussion, to say the least. And lastly, what I call the talk nice and carry a big checkbook approach. Cost share, that's what we do in agriculture, right? We work with the agricultural community. We get them to change the way they're doing their practices and the way they farm. We help them pay for it. They have some skin in the game. The government pays for the rest. But it hasn't gotten us where we need to be. I mean, that's why we are here having this discussion. It has not gotten us anywhere near where we need to be? And will that approach work any better on shorelines or wetlands or oysters or all these shallow water habitats that we're talking about? Living shorelines are a natural type of a shoreline, but call it what you want. To build these things, it's marine contracting. Some of them are easier to build than others, but the majority of the time you need equipment to get the material there, to get it in the water, to deploy it. You need people to operate that machinery. You need people who can get in the water and be skilled to build these things. So it's a skilled labor pool that is extremely limited right now. So in order to go big and go big over some short time frame, we're going to have to figure out how to get more people that are qualified to do this work into a bigger labor pool. And Denise, just a time check. I've just got 2 more slides. I took one economics class in college and got a C+. So I'm not qualified at all here to talk macroeconomics to anybody, but even I understand this slide. This is the classic supply and demand. And when supply is low, like cost share money, like skilled labor, like materials, but demand is high. And if we're going to start pushing towards shorelines, demand is high, supply is low, and prices go up. It's very simple. So we need to be thinking over time, if we can pay for this now, it's going to most likely, I would say, get more expensive over time, not cheaper. So this is not economy of scale where you do a big project over a small project and you can save money. That's true. You mobilize once, you bring in the material once, you bring in your crew once. I'm talking about doing many, 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 many more projects than we currently do. And I think the demand is going to far outpace the supply. And to do that, costs go up. And then lastly, the permitting. We're lucky in Virginia. We have what's called a joint permit application. You fill out one application for a shoreline project. It goes to our state agency, to the Marine Resources Commission, and then they farm it out to DEQ, to other state agencies, to the Army Corps, and local wetlands boards, anybody who needs to put their eyes on this project. So it works pretty well, but it's for right now for a fairly relatively small amount of projects compared to what we hope to do in the future. And if any of you that work for the Army Corps or work with the Army Corps, they're incredibly understaffed. Mike Rolband, our DEQ director, I think told me recently they're still facing a 30% vacancy in their agency. So it is going to be a challenge to keep the process rolling, to keep the wheels rolling in the permitting process and not just create this enormous backlog of projects. So, and I don't mean that to be a big, I didn't come on here to be the nervous Nelly. I mean, I'm just being honest with you. I want this to work. I want shorelines to be protected. I want more wetlands. I want more oysters. We just need to be honest that there are some significant challenges that face us if we want to scale up much, much greater than we currently do. And that's all I've got, Denise.
Oh, thank you both, Jeff and Pam. That was, I build this as clear-eyed, and that was very clear-eyed, and I really, really appreciate that. So I'm going to start off with a question, and I think, Jeff, you sort of touched on it, and I'd like you both to comment on it. The voluntary approach, we've seen it in non-point source pollution, where sometimes it doesn't where we can get people to do things always doesn't match up to where we would do them if we wanted the highest possible effectiveness. So when we're talking about efforts in shallow waters, basically, and let's talk about, wetland restoration and living shorelines, would we have the same sort of issue? Are there places where it's much more beneficial in terms of living resource response than others? Or do we just need to do it wherever we can get it done? I mean, how would we start down the voluntary effort, thinking that, what would our strategy be? Or should we go after, is spatial targeting, recommended, and we would do that from the beginning? So what are your thoughts about that, about the utility of a general voluntary approach versus being able to take advantage of some spatial considerations? And Jeff, why don't you go first, and then Pam can comment.
Sure. I mean, so the science is there. I mean, you can target, and I don't want to answer Pam's, give Pam's answer for her. I mean, my argument would be if you want to focus, I think in the wetlands arena, there's a lot more ability to say, this is where we need wetlands. This is where we should be doing it. In the shoreline, there's still such a small percentage of it that has been protected and protected right. I think there might be some danger to say go here first. I mean, TMDL world, we started with low hanging fruit and now we're, climbing ladder after ladder to get to the higher stuff. Right. And I think we need to be careful not to do all the easy stuff, good stuff first. So honestly, in shorelines, I would go where you can, where there's enough ability to do this, where the landowners are willing to do it. And I would focus more on getting as much done as you can versus targeting exactly where to do it. But that's Jeff Corbin's, position. That's not what computer models might tell us to do.
Thanks. Pam?
So I generally agree with Jeff. And I kind of alluded to that, I think, in my comments is I think it's a multi-scale, multi-location effort we're going to need to apply here in order to have the wetlands providing those benefits. However, we do understand at the system, more of a system scale, that there are certain kinds of wetlands that are likely at greater risk, at least based on some assessments that were done of the York River wetland systems recently, and some of our tidal fresh wetland systems, so tidal but fresh water, so up the rivers, are drowning maybe faster than some of the other systems, and a lot of that has to do with relative sediment supply. So, wetlands lose pace to rising sea because the sea rises, but the land also subsides, and catching sediment is one way that they can offset some of that relative elevation loss. And so in Virginia, anyway, we have had some conversations and some discussions. We have an effort called Conserve Virginia, which is intended to sort of highlight conservation needs. And through that process, one area we have highlighted is tidal fresh. And I will note that we also know that tidal fresh wetlands are very succinctly timed to fisheries, anadromous fish spawning, and food availability. And so that might be another driver for needing, where that time is so much more linked explicitly than some of the other responses are to living resources, more in the outer estuary. So just an observation. But otherwise, I would say all wetlands in all places at all times.
Thanks, Pam. Some questions have been answered in the chat. I'm going to answer one that was submitted ahead of time. And this is to both of you, but I'll let Pam go first this time. How do we, the question was, how do we balance existing shallow water habitat function with long-term resiliency associated with sea level rise? And that's also connected to another question about what sort of trade-offs would be acceptable regarding building resilient and important coastal habitats and impacts on shallow water living resource conditions. So how do we keep both of those in mind, right? Because it's a busy place. The shore.
There are trade-offs and there are tensions. Actually, this came out, some of this conversation evolved in Virginia somewhat recently over dam and marsh restoration in the upper Potomac, where there was an existing marsh that was one of the few in that reach of river, and then there'd become an established SAV of mixed communities. Some was Merophila, but some were our native species like wild celery. And the plan was to basically go out over what was some of the SAV to restore historic wetlands. And so there became this tension of which of those is going to be most sustainable, which combination of relative extents of those two systems would be the most beneficial, and in this case mostly from a living resources perspective. And it's somewhat problematic because I was actually just on a call earlier today talking about some potential restoration projects in the Guinea Marshes, which is the eastern end of Gloucester County, Virginia. And I ended up saying this brilliant thing, which then somebody copied and said, I can't believe you said that. But if you have different approaches to shallow water restoration, it almost, in some ways, it almost doesn't matter, because every fish, whether it's a finfish, a crustacean, a benthic critter, a bivalve, has a different element of a different life cycle that benefits from that habitat, right? So we were talking about, in this case, we were talking about oysters and hard structure and vegetation and soft structure and mud. And it's like, so living shorelines, for instance, provide habitats for multiple different kinds of aquatic organisms. And so do large scale marshes, so do SAV. And so I think it's really hard to have that tension and deal with that tension. I think we are confounded in Virginia by the fact that SAV are now considered a water quality standard. So they have a higher level of protection than wetlands do, basically, you know, because water quality is more important than wetlands. And I'm paraphrasing with this quotes for people who can't see. But it's true. And so, but we might have to, I think we're going to have to make some choices there, because as shallow water expands, which it is, the sea level rise, potentially the area for suitable SAV area is growing, while the area for suitable tidal marsh, being that they are in a very specific elevation frame, is shrinking, whether it's because we're butting up against developed lands that we're going to protect, or topography. So once you leave the outer coastal plain, Virginia, and go to the intercoastal plain, this is true in Maryland too, the topography goes up, and there's only so much edge left that's in that right elevation. So from a from a perspective of what we're going to have more of, we're going to have more open shallow water than we are going to have the proper elevations for tidal marsh. And so we may need to do some shallow water conversion to marshes in order to have them persist.
It's interesting. Jeff, what about from a living shoreline perspective? The same things you do for coastal resiliency and sort of human uses match up what you do for, increased habitat and living resource response?
Well, so there's no doubt there is a tension there between changing one habitat to another. This is a great question, and a very interesting and complex question, because it's not only about trade-offs between habitats, it also brings in the whole permitting, flexibility of permitting. Because right now in most states that we work, if we're going to do a shoreline and put in a sill and we're going to fill that area and we're going to plant that area, if there's SAV there, it ain't happening. If there's an oyster reef there, or a thriving oyster reef, it ain't happening. So there is no trade-off. It's the way the permitting regime is set up, it's going to stay that existing habitat because they are protected habitats. So there's going to need to be some discussion with the regulators. The other thing that it brings in, and I think this is where Pam was going towards the end of her remark, is, right now it's an eroding shoreline. There may be SAV there, but look at what sea level is going to be in 20 years. Look at what some of these shorelines that we work on, they're losing 5 to 6 feet laterally per year. If there's SAV right now there and it's losing that much sediment from the shoreline, the SAV ain't going to make it. It's going to be covered. So it becomes this, talk about a trade-off, right? It's there now, but it's probably not going to be there in 20 years. So do we take some trade-off? Do we protect that shoreline, potentially adversely impact that SAV, but save it in the long term? I don't know. Tough to like I said early on in my remarks, there's going to be some really, really tough discussions to be faced here.
Kristen Saunders, this is a fascinating question. Have there been any efforts to use science to target a general geography and then aggregate landowners that are adjoining to get the scale for living shoreline wetlands work? And have there been any efforts to approach landowners and pay 100% of the cost and maintenance for a period of time? I know the forest buffer folks are looking to stand up a pilot in a similar fashion to remove the typical barriers. So do we need to go full tilt with money and maintenance to get this work done in a timely way? And there's also a counter argument about potentially enriching private waterfront landowners, property value. So have there been any sort of pilots, and I know we've talked about whatever it's called, whatever you want to call it before, but pilots, experiments, sandboxing to say, can we take an area and really try to see what works to scale this up and make it abandonable? Do you know any efforts like that? And either one of you can go first. I'm sure that probably both of you have something to add about that.
Yeah, maybe just let me make a point for the private sector, Pam. I mean, we try to do that all the time. It's not really a scientific issue. It's a business model. If a landowner has, you gotta understand, a lot of the projects we do, we're not talking thousands of feet of shoreline. We're talking 100 feet, 150 feet, 200 feet, 500 feet is a pretty large project for a private landowner. And there's usually one to the right and one to the left, and maybe they've got a bulkhead or maybe they have nothing. So if we can get 5 or 6 of them from a purely financials of running a business and doing this, if we can go out there once and do a 2,500 foot shoreline and mobilize once and bring the material once and go after one big permit instead of 6 small permits, absolutely we want to go to scale. And we've had some success doing that. So we try to talk to other landowners before we go out and do small projects. And I think a lot of the federal money that's coming down, like I said earlier, a lot of this goes to community scale improvements, and they are literally looking for those projects. Can you do a single project that protects 100 homes, not a single landowner, 100 homes? So a lot of this is being looked at that scale, but do we need to go big and throw a bunch of money at this? Yes.
Thanks, Pam.
So I would essentially agree with that. I know that there have been some efforts in the city of Norfolk, for instance, with Sandy funding, put up projects for 10 or 11 living shorelines because of different costs and some miscalculations up front. I think they ended up being able to do 8 of the 10, but then they came in with some other funding, and they were intentionally doing that to start getting a cumulative positive response. So that's why that they were, so they may or not have been longer reaches. So there's 2 different ways to tackle this, right? Individual long reaches, which we concur with Jeff, like from the scientific perspective, we would also prefer that they get done together at one time. First of all, that means the design is intended to address that longer reach. Secondly, the adverse impacts of just implementing a project, because let's face it, it's a construction project. There's going to be a little bit of non-point source, some leakage of sand, whatever, mucking up the edge while you get out there, whichever way you're going from. So those sort of temporal impacts occur once with one big long project, as opposed to 5 or 6 different times as people do things over a period of a decade, let's say, right? So, and we also know that at sort of that level, that the provision of a lot of the ecosystem services increase, and maybe not just arithmetically, but sometimes exponentially, with length of, a marsh along a shoreline, like a fringing marsh, right? So from a scientific perspective, doing more at one time makes sense from both the system's response and also minimizing the adverse impacts. As far as should we throw more money at it, I will tell you that there is a project right now going in the ground in Virginia that's on an agricultural piece of land, because we now are offering Virginia agricultural cost share. And we actually did work with those high costs to doing a long piece of a shoreline, agricultural cost shoreline. We did end up working with the property owner, and it's almost 100%. We had to get variances in the funding, and there's all kinds of sort of things that had to be modified around the existing cost share structure, but the cost share on that project is now almost 100% in order to do that big of a project. And because it's hundreds of feet of shoreline. So 2 different questions there with 2 different potential answers.
Yeah. I'm interested. There's a question. Let me kind of get to it another way. But there's been a lot of discussion around CESR about does this mean this attention to shallow waters means shifting your attention away from nutrient reduction efforts? So there's a way to say, well, these by the general accounting of the model or whatever, these have water quality benefits, and they also have some living resource benefits. Or they're primarily to boost living resource response, and they maybe have a little bit of water quality benefit. Can you talk about the water quality benefit as compared to, you know, something you might be doing up in the watershed?
From a living shoreline perspective, and I don't know how this applies to wetlands or not, but you know, living shorelines are now an approved best management practice in a BMP by the Chesapeake Bay program. So in order to get that, it goes through the expert panel process, which a lot of people are familiar with. So there is a report out that says if you do a shoreline, if you protect it and it has this current soil loss, and you stop that, you are reducing annually nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment by this amount. So living shorelines is absolutely a water quality benefit, and it can be you know, very tightly quantified. If you added all that, I don't know what the answer to my own question is, because if you added all that up, would that be a huge, huge, huge amount compared to what we're trying from agriculture? I don't know how that compares. So probably somebody needs to crunch those numbers. You know, if we did 10,000 miles of shoreline in the bay and stop that erosion, what would that water quality benefit be versus continuing to go after agriculture at the current pace? But yes, you can quantify the water quality benefits from shoreline protection.
So we actually did that analysis in Virginia. So we created polygons based on our living shoreline and our shoreline management model that we have at CCRM. We created a minimum size polygon based on a general permit that Virginia offers for living shorelines, and estimated then, or calculated using the approved BMP load reduction, what if you implemented everywhere a living shoreline could go. And it ended up being on the lower end of percentages of the load reductions that we've committed to in our WIPs, but not insignificant, you know, because again, it's one of those things where we've adversely impacted the Chesapeake Bay by a death of 1,000 cuts, and the solution is going to be lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of band-aids in all different kinds of places. And again, sort of refocus or sort of change the conversation a little bit. We want to get those water quality benefits while accommodating habitat improvement. So we can get both out of wetlands, tidal marsh, and non-tidal adjacent wetlands, and non-tidal wetlands for that matter. You can get both of those things. So you can get the water quality benefits, and you can get the actual credits because they're both approved as BMPs, tidal marsh and non-tidal wetlands. So a project proponent can get credits for a local government or an MS4 community, and maybe partner with their local state wildlife agency or a local nonprofit that's interested. So that's the beauty for me. That's the beauty of wetlands. They provide so many different ecosystem services that almost everybody wants something that comes out of that bucket of services. And so getting those partners together and maximizing what everybody can benefit, you know, from that public interest perspective I think is the key.
We have about 4 minutes left. I just want to remind people that any question that we didn't get to that was either submitted in the chat on this session or submitted in advance, we send to our panelists and ask them to answer them and get that information out back to you. So if we didn't get to your question, have no fear. We're going to try and address it at some point. I'm going to ask you both, as sort of, since we only have 3 minutes left, if you can kind of just address as a closing, what you think a first step would be if we want to really embark on scaling up this work, and how would you advise, you know, local governments to use the information that the things we know about right now? So I'll ask you each to sort of answer that. What would we do first, and what would you maybe suggest a local government could do to take advantage of the information today? So Pam, I'll let you go first, and I'll let Jeff close it out.
Oh, that's a really hard question. So there's definitely a tension with tidal wetlands creation and restoration and valuable waterfront property. And so I think we need to really come up with really efficient incentives and cost share and monetizing those benefits so that we can take local governments that are in a position of using shoreline waterfront property owner as one of their highest valued real estates for getting real estate property taxes that help run their machine, and switch that somehow so they can still be generating some revenue from the property if it becomes a wetland instead. And there are some ways that has happened sort of naturally through the market, like where ecotourism has been proven on the Eastern Shore to actually provide real dollar value. So it often doesn't get accounted for, and local governments aren't necessarily cued into how much it can provide them. Commercial fishing, so the valuation slide that I showed, so real true value, real money value from the people that will come to your localities and fish because you have wetlands, and the wetlands attract the fish and produce the fish, frankly. I mean, well, the fish produce themselves, but the wetlands give them a place to do it. And so really codifying and putting that information in ways that is easily understood and consumable by decision makers, because a lot of times it's really complicated. We need to keep working on that messaging. And I think that's one of the first things, because that's going to be part of how we get to that point of allowing people or encouraging them to buy in on marsh migration, for instance, because we know marsh migration is going to be critical for tidal marsh persistence. It's going to have to move back into land. We can do things, we can buy it time, we can create edges, we can create elevation, but we do have to create that space. So I think some really good communication tools and following up on some of these evaluation projects and bringing that stuff together. And that's what I think probably has to happen next.
And Jeff, you get to have the last word.
Wow. So very quickly, I guess I mentioned earlier that one challenge to shoreline work is public education, to landowner education, because right now we knock on doors. We call people, we talk to them, neighbors talk to neighbors. It's not a, hey, if we do this, we're going to save the Bay, or we're going to save the North Carolina coastal sound or anything. But so having that message come out, and a lot of the people we work with, they live on the coast. They're very much environmentalists. Having that public message be that if we do enough of this will truly make an improvement on protecting the Bay. I think that message to the general populace of landowners could be enormous, that public education component. And then as far as local governments, I'd tell them to get ready, because if we, right now, the way the permitting process works is it all ends up going usually through a local wetlands board. They're reviewing these projects, they're approving these projects. The Virginia CESR program, and I'm sure Aaron or Mike or somebody's on this webinar. I mean, they're a staff of only 2 people, I think, that are moving this cost share fund out. So it's all, as all, we've learned this over the last 25, 30, 40 years, right? All the work ends up coming down through local governments and landowners. So get ready. If we're going to push this hard, they've got to gear up for the workload that's coming their way.
Thank you both. That was excellent. At one point, we had over 110 people on the webinar, which is an indication of the interest and the level of conversation. So thank you very much. Thanks for everyone for attending. We will get to your questions, and we will see you next month.